Então, boa tarde, good afternoon for everyone. It's a pleasure and an honor to be here in the moderation of this session that assembles very interesting papers about our relations with, a critical relation with our pasts, namely the colonial pasts. Three papers, we are still waiting for the last paper because I made my presentation saying that we are going from China to South Africa and Portugal in this journey, but the last paper on South Africa, we are still waiting from the participant. Anyway, both the two papers, the first and the second I'm going to present you are very, very interesting, and this area is one of the main important and interesting issues in contemporary societies and contemporary museums, and after the post-colonial turn and the archival turn, we are reflecting why we need the past, how to represent it, and how to make our excavations in history, basically is the subject. So the first paper is Art, Ideology and Power, Political Appropriations of Art Museums in Asian Post-Colonial Contexts. The Macau Museum of Art has a case study. It will be presented by Patrícia de Sousa Melo. She is a PhD candidate. She is a researcher at the Institute of History of Art of the Faculty of Social Sciences and Humanities in the Universidade Nova in Lisbon. The second paper, but I will return to this presentation to remind people about the both papers, is The Colonial Gaze and Contemporary Technologies of Display, the forthcoming Museum of the Discoveries, which is very curious because we are in the 21st century, and in Portugal, we only now we will have, supposedly, we will have a Museum of the Discoveries. The paper will be presented by Carolina Rito. She is head of the public program and research at Nottingham Contemporary Art in the UK, and she is also a researcher at the Institute of History of Art in the Universidade Nova of at Lisbon. And finally, if she arrives, three women, it's nice because yesterday the museum, anyway, I present the title. The museum has an archival space for practices of decolonial curating by Nancy Dantas, also a PhD candidate in the area of art history and visual culture in Rhodes University, and also liaison officer in the University of Cape Town in South Africa. So we are very, very attentive and interested in what you have to tell us. Thank you.
Good afternoon. I want to thank you, the organization committee, for giving me the opportunity to present part of my research. And today I'll be talking about art, ideology and power, and how the Macau Museum of Art is politically appropriated by the political state of China. The new museum practices in the 21st century led to a shift from the modern museum to the postmodern museum. Modern museum that aimed to instruct and civilize, to where the communication model was made by transmission and the curator held all the authority, to a postmodern museum with a more reflective practice that also led to a shift on the communicative paradigm. And thus the museum became more open, inclusive towards its visitors and especially the local communities. However, these reflective practices are not universal. There are some cases and some geographical and cultural contexts where there is the persistence of the values and attributes of the modern museum. The institution still is a symbol of the dominant political power, an instrument of states' ideology through the highlighted collections and displays. And this is exactly the case of People's Republic of China, a country that is governed by the Chinese Communist Party, that has a nationalist ideology and aims to build cultural hegemony and a totalizing vision of the Chinese identity through patriotism, using education and cultural affairs as its vehicles. And in this case, education and museums are inside the same sector as vehicles for patriotism. So I noticed that the same situation appears to occur in the Macau Museum of Art during the time that I was conducting fieldwork in Macau for my PhD dissertation, and it occurs in a subtle way and in a less degree than it happens in China, because Macau is a special administrative region and is a territory with a certain degree of autonomy. However, this reading cannot be separated from the economic and political and social context of Macau since its creation. Macau was a Portuguese settlement in the 16th century. Its dynamic trade attracted a number of groups of people, especially Asian and more specifically Chinese, due to geographic proximity. And it was not a colony in the strict sense of the term, because there wasn't a relationship of dominance and of power and subjugation between the colonizer, the Portuguese, and the biggest group, the Chinese. There was a formal consent, official consent and authorization from the Chinese authorities for the Portuguese to be present in the territory, and also for its administration, even though it would still be a part of China. It was, so for almost 3 centuries, there was a harmony and multicultural coexistence between all the groups. And it was only in the 19th century where Portugal tried to reinforce its power over the colonies and the overseas empires that created a situation with some conflicts that also occur in 20th century. And because it wasn't a colony, there was not the process of decolonization in the strict sense also. There was a handover ceremony from the Portuguese administration to the Chinese government in December 21st, 1999. And in the previous years of the handover, there was a number of reforms that were conducted by the Portuguese administration in various sectors. The cultural sector was one of them. And during this period, there were many museums that were created and many measures that were implemented for the protection of cultural heritage, not only for protecting the cultural assets, but also to leave a mark and a legacy over the territory where the Portuguese stayed for over 4 centuries. It was in the context of these reforms that the Macau Museum of Art was created in March 1999, and it forms together with from left to right, it forms together with Macau Cultural Center, Macau Science Center, and the Handover Gifts Museum of Macau, a cultural complex that is located in NAP, which is one of the newest areas of the city. This geographic location, it's not only convenient because there's a lack of there was and still there is a lack of construction space in Macau. But it's also symbolic because the place where the Handover Gifts Museum was created It was where the ceremony, handover ceremony took place. So these 4 buildings also form an architecture landmark, the end and beginning of an area, and they also contribute to the transformation of the urban landscape. So through the analysis of some museum aspects, I will try to show what I told before, that there's a very subtle way of political appropriation of the institution, and I will start with the mission. These 3 sentences were taken from the museum websites, but they're not very clear and objective about what is the mission of the museum. It only states that it's the largest and the only museum that is dedicated to the arts in Macau, and that tries and aims to pursue the objective art, to create and to share, and the motto life, love, art. I also highlighted in the 3rd sentence the exhibitions concern Ming and Qing dynasties, because you can see how there's already highlighted aspects of the most important exhibitions. The Macau Museum of Art has contemporary architecture, has 5 floors and plenty of space for many displays at the same time. But and has all the regular facilities of a Western Museum of Art. But what struck me the most when I was doing my research is that it has 2 shops: the museum shop that sells merchandising and books concerning the museum's collections, and also the Museum of the Imperial Palace shop that sells merchandising related with the collections that are displayed in the Museum of Imperial Palace, which is located in the Forbidden City in Beijing. So my reading is that there's maybe not so subtle way of China imposing its presence over this autonomous territory after 1999 through art, because what we can see in the image on the right is the catalog of the merchandising that is sold in the shop, and it is mainly collections that are displayed in Beijing, which is also the center of power. The connections with the Handover Gifts Museum are also very clear, not only because they are located geographically in the same place, but because the Macau Museum of Art also manages this museum. The mission of the museum is not clear. It doesn't state that it is an art museum, but it displays artworks that were produced for a specific moment, for traditional Chinese arts like wood carving, painting, sculpture, and they were offered, it was a gift for each province, and they were offered to Macau for commemorating the return to the motherland. The collections of the museum are varied. Some of them, especially the traditional Chinese arts, they came from the Louis Camões Museum, which was the first museum of art in Macau. It opened in 1960s, but it closed down due to erratic existence, and the collections were scattered, but luckily some of them were kept in the Macau Museum of Art. There's also contemporary art, especially related with local artists, photography, propaganda posters, and also new acquisitions that are made regularly by the museum. The highlighted collections of the museum in the museum websites are first the Ama Temple in art, and this for me is very clear as a link between the museum and the central power, because the Ama Temple is the most ancient and important temple in Macau. And since the 1918s, there's been a debate between Chinese scholars and Western academics due to the date of construction of the temple, because there's Chinese in the Chinese historiography, the temple, it's prior to the Portuguese arrival at territory. So it states that if there is a temple, it was because there was a village and the territory was already developed, so the Portuguese was not at all the cause of the development of the territory. And this is very important concerning national narratives. And then the Sichuan ceramics, which are from Foshan, a city in the Guangdong province in China. They are very specific in terms of technology production. The kilns start operated in the Tang dynasty and developed during the Ming and Qing dynasties. And they also had imperial kilns, so there is also a very close connection with the Chinese, with the national identity, in the sense that it's not only one of the most remarkable Chinese arts, but also because the artworks for the emperors were made there. And also the historical paintings of Macau in the 19th century, they concern historical paintings from Macanese and Western painters, like George Chinnery, for example, depicting scenes of daily life and also Western personalities that lived in Macau at the time. The museum has a large space for temporary exhibitions, displays contemporary art of Macau, displays other exhibitions in cooperation with Western art museums. For instance, last year there was a big display about Auguste Bourget, and especially it cooperates with Chinese museums and mostly with the Imperial Palace. And I would also like to highlight that the first exhibition that was displayed when the museum opened was exactly the exhibition of the best Imperial Palace objects. Again, marking the beginning of an era with the best collections of the museum. The museum has 3 permanent exhibitions: the Sichuan ceramics and historical paintings that I talked about previously, and also the calligraphy and paintings of Canton masters, which also displays what Chinese arts have as best artworks. So through the analysis of some of these aspects, I concluded there's a political appropriation of the institution for nationalist purposes. That leads to the construction of a hegemonic narrative of Chinese cultural and national identity, that there's a dissonance between the role of the Macau Art Museum and the roles of other art museums in recently created countries that were decolonized. And the museum is not a neutral ground, but a political arena. For the first part, I would like to say that the highlighted collections and displays, the connections with the other museum, the shop of the Imperial Palace, and we can see also in the image that this is the souvenir guide. It's yellow. Yellow is the color of the emperor, and there are very subtle relationships and links between how the museum operates and how it portrays and the message that it conveys to its visitors. And therefore it disseminates patriotic messages and constructs a narrative that tends to establish a cultural hegemony. And of course a sense of belonging with the national and cultural Chinese identity. And this vision is also reinforced by the inclusion of the heritage, the cultural heritage sector and measures for its preservation in the plan for developing Macau from 2016-2020 that was presented to the population in Macau last year. The cultural sector is included in the section of welfare of the population, and conveying patriotic messages like love Macau, love the motherland, Macau belongs to Greater China, etc., etc. This is not subtle, and it's for me, it's a way of China extending his presence over this autonomous territory as a form of control. And in this sense, it's also trying to implement the patriotic education in Macau and also Hong Kong, which is also a special administrative region. So this situation constitutes a paradox and a contradiction in the sense that China tries to reinforce its power as soon as we approach 2049, which will be the year when this transition period of one country, two systems will be over. And it tries to be more open to the West with the increasing of the economic and commercial relationships, but at the same time, it creates this unified vision and message of national identity. And on the other hand, the reference for Macau's cultural identity that they were chosen after 1999 by the local government were the cultural heritage that was constructed and formed during the first centuries of encounters and interaction of the Portuguese with the Chinese. That was so important that led to the classification of the historical center as World Heritage by UNESCO in 2005, and it's an important source of income because it attracts millions of visitors every year. The second part is that there is a dissonance of the role of this museum and the role of other art museums that are created in post-colonial context. Because it was in the process of decolonization but integration in a larger country, the resistance and addressing the issues of the colonial power and subjugation and violence are not the same as in these other museums. So we don't have, and also we don't have in this museum a post-colonial artwork that interrogates or discusses or debates these colonial issues. So there's no provocation, interrogation, discussion, disruption. It's not a place of memories, it's a place of memory, and there's not also plurality of perspectives. The conflict, and even though it wasn't a colony, but it had a colonial period, so it had a colonial past that is not discussed. It's absent from the space of the museum, and there are good opportunities for having this discussion, for instance, with the collection, the historical paintings of Macau in the 19th century, exactly the century where all this conflict started. So in this sense, there's no discussion, and the contemplation is replaced, the confrontation is replaced by confrontation of the artworks and other words like harmony and friendship, etc. Also, the sub-representation of certain communities, there's a large community. Chinese is represented, of course, Macau is also, but Macau was and is, and I think it will be due to its geographic location and to the unique attributes of its formation, a place of multicultural groups and various groups with different ethnic and cultural backgrounds. And they're not represented in the space of the museum. For instance, the Filipino community, which is the largest community following the Chinese, it doesn't have a voice in the space of the museum. And in the previous slide where I showed the mission of the museum, it says that it states as a place of presenting the arts of Macau. And this community makes Macau its home too. So this compromises the educative role of the museum in a sense, and also how it connects with the visitors and the local communities, and how can they be relevant to these groups. So this leads us to the last but not least slide of my presentation, that the museum is not a neutral ground, but a political arena like we've been seeing lately, especially in the United States due to the election of Donald Trump. So in this case, the museum is a space where the narratives and the meanings of concerning the nation and national Chinese and cultural Chinese are constructed and reconstructed through the highlighted collections and displays. And in this way, the museum still convey the values and attributes of the modern museum, in the sense that it tries to instruct and civilize the visitors for one vision, which is the national and the Chinese identity, thus excluding all the other groups that they do not identify themselves with that identity. And also there's another question, which is this national Chinese identity, that it only conveys the majority of the ethnic community, which is Han, and leave the other ethnic minorities excluded. So there's also this issue that is not treated in a very inclusive way. So we can see that the modern museum still coexists with the postmodern and the post-colonial museum, and that these new institutional practices that we are addressing here today and discussing in this space are not taken for granted in other contexts where the museum exists, because even though they exist outside Europe, they're not. There are some practices like the institutional practice and this reflective practices that cannot be taken for granted in those territories. So we need to address these issues when we have the opportunity to do so, in order to make these museums relevant for their communities and for their visitors. And therefore, I would like to finish my presentation with two citations that illustrate how this duality of the vision of the museum in the 21st century. The first one concerns a report of speech by the Minister of Culture that says that museums should intensify efforts to popularize patriotism and socialism. And in the below sentences, Carol Duncan says that museums are powerful identifying machines, and they have the power to define and rank and to declare some as having greater share than the others in the community heritage in its varied identity. And I think it's exactly what happens in this case study, even though it's an exploratory study that needs obviously further research. And that's all. Thank you for your time.
So I have already presented Carolina, but to remind the title. And okay. To remind the title and to be close to you. I'm again here. The colonial gaze in contemporary technologies of display, the forthcoming Museum of the Discoveries. Finally, a museum of discoveries. Okay?
Thank you so much. Hello, everybody. Can you hear me? Yes? Okay. First of all, thank you so much for bearing with us, because it's a beautiful day outside, and I'm surprised there's still so many people in the room. So I'm not the last one, I guess, or eventually I am, without knowing yet. But anyway, so to start with, obviously, thank you so much for all presenters. They have been super interesting. I unfortunately couldn't attend the whole conference today, but I managed to do some in the morning and in the afternoon as well. Very timely discussions. It's never too much to delve into these topics. I totally agree with this. So just in terms of acknowledgements, I would like just to, a special thanks to, she's now busy, but to Sandra and Emilia for putting this together, for the incredible work, and particularly to also the work that Sandra has been developing by mapping a lot of less story-sized practices in contemporary in contemporary Portugal. So my presentation today is, I'm standing because I've sat in the back before and I understood that it's hard to see people, so that's the reason. My presentation today is gonna delve into two main topics. First, I want to look at the most recent museological projects dedicated to the so-called discoveries in Portugal. And for those of you that are not from Portugal or not familiar with the term discoveries, it basically stands to describe 500 years of the imperialist project. And these 500, so 5 centuries, more or less starting in the 15th century and running, actually interesting that we had a presentation about Macau, because I would exactly use 1999 as the ending point or ending date of this imperialist project. In terms of being colony or not, something that we could further discuss. And also to look at celebration of the imperialist past under the contemporary conditions of neoliberalism and the crisis. And here I'm particularly thinking of the touristification of culture in this context. So this analysis, more than being a museological study on the exhibition's histories, I'm not an historian, so exhibition's histories in display, it is a study that intends to draw lines between contemporary museological practices, visual cultures, and the politics of exhibition. And it aims at reading these current phenomena, so again, these museological projects dedicated to the discoveries, so reading these phenomena as the fetish for the loss of the empire that comes about through the uncritical touristification of the discoveries narrative. I'll do this by looking at two main sets of material, let's say. This is my wording. So on one hand, I describe so part of the material as being infrastructural, and I'm particularly looking at the last 8 years during which we had the emergence of some museums of the discoveries, and don't be surprised, yes, they exist in this country. One of them is open in 2009 in Belmonte, in the inland Portugal, not very far from the border with Spain in the east, and is dedicated, so its main focus is on the colonization of Brazil, and particularly looking at Pedro Álvares Cabral, originally from there. And also the Wax Museum of the Discoveries, yes, in Algarve, in Lagos, opened in 2014, for some of you probably a surprise. And finally, the amazing World of the Discoveries in Porto that opened in 2014, opened by Pedro Passos Coelho, back then our Prime Minister. So this is the infrastructural material, and then in terms of the discursive material, I will be looking at, again, the last 7 years, more or less, when it became more and more visible that Lisbon was not competing seriously with this emergence of new museums across the country. And so our former Minister of Culture, Gabriela Canavilhas, in 2010, came public saying that, yes, we will have a Museum of the Discoveries, and it is going to be hosted in the Jerónimos Monastery, because it's the best venue for that. And for those of you that know the symbolic meaning of Mosteiro dos Jerónimos, Jerónimos Museum is one of the peaks that highlight the ultimate example of the architecture of the discoveries, precisely built in the 16th century during the, if I'm not mistaken, during Dom Manuel I, the first, and named the style, the architectural style, named after him. So very symbolic. And so I will kind of relate this announcement, so the announcement of the new Museum of Discoveries in Lisbon, with a most recent, even more recent announcement that dates back to September 2016, so a few months ago, when a local administration from Lisbon also announced a new regeneration program with the money of because for those of you that are not from here, you have to pay a tax when you come and visit Lisbon. So it's the tourist's fee, I guess. So in order to use that money productively, they decided to put together this regeneration program that also includes a museum of the discoveries. So in order to delve into this material, I want to structure my talk by telling you what I mean by museum, and then slightly moving towards what I call the expanded field of exhibition making, in order to kind of contextualize what I call the rebranding of the discoveries narrative through the touristification of culture, as I said before. So these are the quotes so that you can follow, but they will be just shortly. In order to contextualize then the term museums and what I mean about that, I would kind of draw on Hooper Greenhill when she argues that the ruptures of the French Revolution, and now I quote, created the conditions of emergence for a new truth, a new rationality, out of which came a new functionality for a new institution, the public museum. These readings date back to 89. Established as means of sharing what have previously been private, and again, you have to contextualize the project of the museum within, of course, after the French Revolution, but really opening up private collections owned by aristocrats and royal family into the general public as a way to educate the people. So, established as means of sharing what have previously been private, of exposing what had been concealed, the public museum, again quoting, exposed both the decadence and tyranny of the old forms of control, the ancien régime, and the democracy and utility of the new, the republic. End of quotes. The museum was proclaimed as an instrument to serve the collective good of the state, to educate the people for democracy. Yet, the museum, and this is the part that I'm more interested in, the museum was also shaped into being as an apparatus with three deeply contradictory functions. That of the elite temple of the arts, and here again we have to think of this movement from private to public. So again, the elite, the collection that was shown was made by the elite of the society. So turning this into the temple, the museum into the temple of the arts, but also that of a utilitarian instrument for democratic education, and more important for this particular talk, as an instrument of the disciplinary society, as described by Foucault. Foucault doesn't really delve into museums, but Tony Bennett, that was already mentioned here, and Douglas Cream, they do refer to the carceral archipelago, and they say, well, we can actually see the museum as a continuation or a kind of a setting of control by other means, compared to the prison, the asylum, etc. So, but kind of public, instead of being in the outskirts, outside of the public view, but within the society, but very much operating in the same setting of surveillance. So I go to the museum, I see someone, and someone sees me. So it's operating the same way. Therefore, it would inform, eventually, which I agree it does, to shape the new citizen in the new disciplinary society and the idea of the man with capital M. Also, the museum kind of set up the division between the producers and the consumers of knowledge, and here we have scientific language in order to legitimize what we see in museums, and also the management of what is made visible and what is made invisible. So, as Henrietta Licci explores in the poetics and the politics of exhibiting other cultures, and this is a book edited by Stuart Hall called Representation, there is a connection between the rise of museums and the expansion of Western nations, namely the European colonial project. And not only regarding museums, but also through international exhibitions and theme parks, as argued by Tony Bennett. So international exhibitions in theme parks, they are more flexible. They serve more immediate political agendas because they can respond to the needs of the present, whereas the permanent collections have to sit there in the same way, etc. So they are more adaptable and responsive. But still, all these mechanisms, this constellation of formats, were used to convey Western ideology based on Western superiority, racial hegemony, and the culturalization of the other. We have the knowledge, you have culture. And Portugal was not an exception, obviously, in all this context. The Portuguese most remarkable example is the exhibition of the Portuguese world set in 1940 to celebrate the anniversary of the foundation of the country. In a political level, this exhibition was for Salazar, the dictator that ruled between late 20s of the last century and the late 60s, and then passed it over to another dictator that ruled the country until 74. A way to put together, so this political project by Salazar was a way to put together a multidimensional example of his imperialist and racist ideology. As part of that exhibition, we have still this big monument that was one of the landmarks of the exhibition. It's called Padrão dos Descobrimentos, in Portuguese, Monument to the Discoveries in English. In many tourist guides you will find it. Created by Cotinelli Telmo, back then the general curator of the show, and also the sculptor Leopoldo de Almeida. And here you see represented Caravela, the Portuguese ship with the white conquerors. To think of exhibition as a historical in-situated event allows for an understanding of exhibition as more than a set of objects on display and their accessibility to the public. Exhibition is also the institutional mechanisms that govern display and knowledge production. Showing is never only about what is made visible, but also about what is made invisible by the means of visibility. By following this line of thought, exhibition is not what is exhibited only, but the immanent network of power structures and intensities that govern visibility that are inscribed way beyond, this is my claim, way beyond the exhibition space. So understanding exhibition as an immanent network allow us to actualize the role of this museum in a larger picture, and namely nowadays in contemporary Portugal. So how do we understand the broader field of the exhibitionary technologies beyond the temporality and the space of the museum? How can we actualize the exhibitionary capacities of these monuments beyond the exhibition of 1940? So for this point, it is important to note that the politics of technologies of display are not exclusive to museums. Exhibitionary practices, so giving something to be seen, can be situated in popular culture, official narratives, public announcements, and I will claim in the current touristification of culture, that is to say, tourism activities and infrastructures. And this goes back a bit to the infrastructural discursive thing that I presented at the beginning. This is particularly evident in contemporary Portugal with the rise of the tourism economy. So a quick search online on Lisbon and its wonders leads us to Go Lisbon website that offers top 10 Lisbon tours. Unfortunately, I don't have all of them here, but where the number one of these lists among these tours is a travel to the Golden Age. Although it refers back to the Portuguese colonial times, the surprising truth, or not, is that the tourists in today's Portugal do not need to have much of an imagination or knowledge about Portuguese Golden Age, because most of its representations are set in stone, literally. And they can be visited, they are a stone throw from each other. So again, we go back, for those that know Lisbon, we go back to the Padrão dos Descobrimentos, Monument to the Discoveries, we go back to Jerónim's Monastery, we go back to the Square of the Empire, etc., etc. So as listed, you maybe can read or not, but I'll tell you. So this tour is composed by the Monument to the Discoveries, sure, the Empire Square, the Belém Tower, the Jeronymus Monastery, the Maritime Museum, and the icing, the Orient Museum. But this is far from being the only way to discover the history of violence and atrocities that mark the Portuguese past. Their remnants are also in famous covers of Portuguese newspapers, dating just a few years back. This is the 1st of March, if I'm not mistaken, of 2014. And this is the beginning of a big sort of new editions that Public organized as part of the celebration or the beginning of the World Cup in Brazil. So, for those of you that don't speak Portuguese, Brasil Descoberto means Brazil discovered. Again, we go back to the same terminology, and this is not a coincidence. And the banana with the colors of the Brazilian flag. This is a very unfortunate combination between the colonial terminology discovered and a banana. The readings of the tropical fruit as a symbol are arguably multiple, and I'm open to that. But in the context in which it is presented, it is clearly a reference to the Banana Republic phrase, popularized as a derogative and racist expression to refer to Latin American countries, and was coined by US-American writer O. Henry in 1904 in a book called Cabbages and Kings. I mean, the literary reference here is less interesting than actually the meaning that then it gained in the future. But also racism inhabits some of colloquial expressions, such as denegrir, denigrate in English, and also, as I presented at the beginning, the museums of the discoveries. And this is just two bad pictures taken from their website. This is the Museum of Discoveries in Belmonte. But also Lagos, as I said before, and Porto. So just for you to understand also the kind of language that is used alongside these very terrific displays, I'm going to tell you just like short passages from their website, and this is again the Belmont Museum. The museum tackles I'm quoting, the museum tackles the history of the discoveries as a unifying element of the new world, of Pedro Álvares Cabral, the arrival to Brazil, the development and the construction of a comrade country, their icons and the Portugality. There's more. This museum aims to show, study, and communicate the great deed of Pedro Álvares Cabral, again, this man that I said, that was originally from Belmont, and we kind of contextualize him as saying was eventually the Portuguese navigator to visit what is called today Brazil. And to continue, and to explore, so the museum explores the history of the biggest Portuguese-speaking nation, which over the course of 5 centuries, and this is how they refer to colonial times, 5 centuries, was built through the extraordinary interchange between cultures. Great. So these texts come along with equally racist and colonial language, and this is not only in these museums, this is language we use on a daily basis, this is language that we learn in school, not only in high school, but also in universities. So great Portuguese explorers instead of colonizers, conquered lands instead of colonized lands, and this is the top, Portugal's pioneering role in world exploration. So to this terminology that inhabits our everyday language and also the discursive material of these museums, I call intentionally diverted lexicon, and I'm being nice. So in the sense of trying to brand these atrocities in a way that they sound actually nice and big and grandiose. So in order to conclude, I want to claim that the three phenomena, so basically intentionally diverted lexicon, touristification of culture, and expanded field of exhibitionary technologies, play an important role in the uncritical rebranding of the discoveries narrative. Additionally, and this is an important point for me, as part of a political project, this is a bigger project, it's a bigger political project, and it's not just administration-wise. This is something that really is embedded, entrenched in Portuguese society. It is driven by the traumatic loss of the empire, to be fulfilled eventually with touristic tours to the Golden Age and new museums of the discoveries. So the crossovers between these three axes allow us to read this phenomena within a larger political project where museums, theme parks, and exhibitionary practices are seen as technologies of governance by the means of giving something to be seen. The exhibitionary practices expand way beyond the formal exhibition space, namely towards the modes of representation through the media, tourism, and entertainment. As so rightly wrote recently the Portuguese historian Ramada Curto in Expresso newspaper, national newspaper, about the recent controversy around the global Lisbon exhibition at the National Museum of Ancient Art in Lisbon, is that the polemic should not overlook the fact that the political vision is to subsume the historical narrative to the celebration of the Portuguese Empire. And he uses the term in Portuguese, comemorativismo, or celebrationism in English. In the contemporary post-crisis, a fertile soil was prepared by political agendas over the last 20 years for the implementation of an uncritical celebration of the Portuguese past, of a history that was never decolonized. The great atrocities continue to be presented as glorious and as heroic turning points in history, presenting the colonized territories and peoples as dispossessed from history and knowledge, sitting in a timeless path of tradition and culture. And go to the Ethnographic Museum. This rebranding of history, more than a construction of a new narrative, is the continuity of a non-decolonized history that is now taken up under the benevolence and neutrality of the tourism economy. This fertile and uncritical soil comes hands in hand with the trauma imprinted in nationalist narratives that cross Portuguese literature, culture, etc., such as Sebastianism and the promise of the Quinto Império, for those of you that know what I'm talking about. We need to make sure that this search is not a hidden way to intensify the imperial and colonial nationalism that is presented as benevolent and entertaining, taken for granted, and dogmatic. And to finally conclude, if I still have a few minutes, no, one maybe, let's see. To finally conclude, I just wanted to read a very short passage of Plantation Memories, Episodes of Everyday Racism, written by Grada Quilomba. Grada Quilomba is a writer, poet, lecturer, and psychoanalyst with origins in São Tomé and Príncipe, born in Lisbon, teaching in the Humboldt University in Berlin. This passage describes an episode of her teenagehood in Portugal after the revolution, this is important to say, in so-called democratic Portugal. So bear with me, it's very short. So at school, this is me quoting, at school, I remember white children sat in the front of the classroom while the black children sat in the back. We from the back were asked to write with the same words as those in the front because we are all equal, the teacher said. We were asked to read about the Portuguese discovery epoch, even though we do not remember being discovered. We were asked to write about the great legacy of colonization, even though we could only remember robbery and humiliation. And we were asked not to inquire about our African heroes, for they were terrorists and rebels. What a better way to colonize than to teach the colonized to speak and write from the perspective of the colonizer. Thank you so much.
Okay, so we have now our period for a debate, and you may have questions.
I'd like to put a question to Carolina Rito, because I think you put very well this dichotomy between knowledge and culture, between the colonizer and the colonized. When you say, for instance, we have the knowledge, you have culture. Because there was a very important debate on multiculturalism. Charles Taylor wrote that book, Multiculturalism, in 1994. But multiculturalism means different cultures that are contemporary in a given place in a given time. But these cultures not necessarily communicate among them. So there was another debate about this second concept, which is interculturalism, which tries to debate this communication between cultures. I'm sorry. And now there is another debate about a third concept, which is transculturalism. And in some way, Tony Bennett speaks about that too, because transculturalism is the translation of culture into knowledge. And maybe that makes the whole difference, because in museums we don't talk very often about the knowledge on the other. So my question, and to go to the question, is simply this. Shouldn't be the museum a transcultural museum and not just a intercultural or multicultural museum?
Mm-hmm. Thank you for your question. I'm not as familiar as you are with all the terminology and the genealogy of the terms. So, in terms of culture, is a very loaded word. When I said we have knowledge and you have culture, I was quoting Mignolo, who's a theoretician on post-colonial studies from Latin America, and he's very much thinking of the way in which the other is portrayed in European museums. And this is, I mean, in Europe, you go anywhere. You go to the Netherlands, you go to Italy, you go to the UK, you go to Portugal, and you have all the same approach. So it's a decent approach to the other. The other doesn't have a speech, doesn't have a saying, so it's totally representative. And what Stuart Hall says in relation to that representation is that representation is a mode of language, is a language that informs ideas and conveys in a way the realm of possibilities. If this is the set of questions that I'm exposed to when I am a child and then a teenager and then an adult studying in Coimbra, of course this is the language that I know that I'm going to use as if this is normal and as if it's normal, but also it's normalized within our ways of thinking about our past, our present, and our identity. So in a sense, I don't really want to, not because I probably don't have my own ideas, but I don't want to jump into a model that would be ideal. But just bear in me in the sense that I prefer to look at what we have and really understand that, really to ask, are we ready to propose something new? And who is going to decolonize this language? Is it us again? So this is really very much the questions that I pose to myself when delving into these topics, but also when I go to the museums of the tropics in the Netherlands, for instance. And I asked to the lady in the reception, so in which way is Latin America? Because I wanted to visit their collection. And she said, oh, is that way and that way? And I said, oh, and where is Europe? And she said, Europe? No, Europe, no. We have everything. You name it, we have it, but not Europe. So of course we don't represent each other. We don't have that background culture, right? So what these museographic discourses do is to totally stabilize this other in a kind of timeless time where there's no, so we do progress, we create evolution in a way. The other is living in a still time. And this is the generic, and this is new museography. I'm not talking about something that was done in the 90s only. So, to go back to the trans, eventually, I don't know how it would look like. I know of an example or a situation that I thought was quite thought-provoking, but of course it's not in Europe, is in Colombia. Colombia is going through a process now of a peace agreement that is by far going to sort out all the problems, because it's just an agreement with one of the guerrillas that have been fighting this war for 50 years. But nevertheless, they are looking at their heritage and memory and traumatic memory. And still in a very problematic museum, the National Museum, they are kind of room by room, kind of reinstalling. So you still can, because I went there now, and only one room is now refurbished in a way. But so you have the contrast between the previous narrative and the new one. But the new one is actually very compelling, because they manage precisely to bring what is called indigenous knowledge or indigenous practice into the same level of the so-called Creole elite. So it's kind of, it's dealing with the topic in a, yes, it's not like sorted, there's many things to be done, but at least you can tell that this history of violence is there for people that were massacred like 2 years ago. It's there. And so there's many ways, I think, to create these dialogues. At least we can try. I don't think we are doing very well in that regard.
Yes, I have a question to Patricia. You were talking about modern museum and postmodernism museum, and you said that modern museum is dominated by political power. What about the postmodern museum? And is power always a bad thing?
If power is always a bad thing, it depends how it's used, I guess. But in the case of how museums have been used by political power, it's not a very, in my opinion, not a very, it's not a good representation of power. Even today, like I said before, with the political dimension of museums, that is now being more in the spot because of Donald Trump. In this sense, the connections with the political sides or the political dimensions of museums are good, because they're used for to contest and to create a movement of resistance to the dominant power. So did I ask your question? I don't. Yeah. Okay. Thank you.
Hi, it's working, yeah. Thank you very much for both of your interventions. I want to ask a question to Carolina. Thank you very much. I really liked your presentation, because that is a theme that I have been thinking for a while here in Portugal. And my question is, if these museums that more or less are recognized as a place of power, museums are recognized of it, were not allowed by a lot of other language, like street names, like the Expo 98 about oceans, a lot of vocabulary that is near discoveries, but try to make this word invisible by using another's, like India, discoveries, the sea, and all this imagination. Even when, I don't know, 4 years ago, we had a boat representing Portugal on the Venice Biennale. And this question was not brought to discussion again. We have a boat again there, so that's it. Thank you very much.
I think it's interesting. Thank you for your question. Maybe it's not a question, right? Is your a comment? Is it a question? Oh, sorry. These other mechanisms besides museums, like
Sure.
Oh, sorry, I'm with you. Yeah, totally. So, as I said during my presentation, museums are just one of the formats available for this. Not only in terms of exhibition making, so I referred also to international colonial exhibitions that became very famous in the late 19th century, beginning of the 20th century, and without surprise, Expo is actually the continuation of that format. So 1998 is actually when we celebrate the 500th year of the arrival in India, you know. And the same when you're talking about 92, sorry to put you on the spot, but as 92 in Sevilla, is precisely also to commemorate the arrival in Latin America. Back then, not Latin, of course. So this is kind of very telling of the way in which we manipulate and instrumentalize this discourse. That's very much what I was trying to say in relation to, it's a bit wordy, but you know, I just came up with this intentionally divertive lexicon, which is like a euphemism to say that we are totally turning upside down for our own sake what we could be telling in relation to this interchange, exchange, multiculturalism, whatever, which is obviously not, is a history of rapism, is a history of destruction, is a history of destruction of languages, of people, of culture, of knowledge, of everything, okay? We cannot even talk about them because they don't exist anymore. So this is what we have, right? What do we do with this? We have to handle. It's not going to be sorted. It's not going to be a resolution for the whole times, but we have to handle this. There's many people thinking about this, not in the museums, but there's many people. I think contemporary artists are doing an interesting work, trying to deal with these archives. It's complicated, yes, but it needs to be done. I would like to see it in a broader scale, in a political scale. I think looking at education curricula, it's crucial, urgent. We cannot do anything without it. And this is exhibition for me. Sorry, just to go back, this is exhibition for me. This is basically giving something to be seen as part of the display. Can be knowledge, narratives, public announcements. This is exhibition, it's exposure. So we need to think of those mechanisms as part of what we know, which is exhibition making, and try to analyze these cultural phenomena through that lens. I think is going to help us to understand beyond the exhibition space.
Thank you very much for both presentations. You both, that's why you are in the same session. You both addressed the same issue, which is the role of the museum in a given political and cultural context. Having said this, I promise to be brief, even if I know I'm going to break the promise, but I'll try. And I don't want to sound like the devil's advocate, but I was really interested in both presentations, but particularly in yours because it is more related to what I'm doing. And I think you just approach an issue that really needs to be discussed. But it has to be discussed with attention. You have to be careful because we are dealing here with epistemological, ontological concepts that are transversal to scientific research today. What do I mean by this? It's when you talk about museography related to some kind of subject related to the past, you are dealing also with historical practice that has its own rules, its own set of methodological and epistemological procedures. So what I'm trying to say with this is, of course, here in Europe and in the Western world, we have a narrative. And this narrative really needs to be challenged by a deeper look that is not only done by us, historians, sociologists, researchers, experts in museum studies, or I just lost what I was trying to say, but whatever. It's not just that, but curators as well, and museum institutions as institutions. But we have to bear in mind that there are some, when we talk about Lisbon as a global city, or we are talking about interchange between different cultural realities, that is a fact. But is a fact how? How is this a fact? How did this happen? And as you said, we need, and this is happening just now, and this is I think it's a very revealing example, which is our recent history, the colonial war. Just only now, in the past 5 or 6 years, are historians daring to deal with it and to tell a different story that is not a political or ideological drawn one. But, and I'm sorry, I'm just going to conclude. What I'm trying to say is there's a historical practice that is dealing with topics and subjects in a very serious way. But we need to have other voices joining this this universe, telling other stories and challenging these stories and telling the rest of what's happening in the rest of the picture. And then we have to know how we're going to transpose that to museography and what we want to do with this museography. Of course, when we deal with museography or we're dealing historical practice, we are always in a political and ideological context. We are always there, but there are there's a scientific framework that is existent, and we work within it. So we have to think how we're going to articulate both realities. I don't know if I'm being very clear, but it's just, it's a bit, we have to be careful because the reality is more complex than that. Lisbon was global. There was a multicultural interchange. But how did this happen? Do you understand? And we can resume all that with this.
Is it a question or just a comment?
It's a comment. I'm sorry, I was not.
Do you want me to say something?
I was trying to be brief, but
no, don't worry. We have time.
Actually, your presentation deals with a lot of issues we can't just summarize in a comment or in a, or eventually even in a question.
Sure.
In this context. But it's just, I just want to underline that there's historical practice and there's museography and there's a political and ideological discourse. We can use both as a means to achieve something, but historical practice has a set of rules.
Okay, I can say something. Okay. Do I have time to say something, or is it like we have to close? Can I just say something before you close? Okay.
To make 2 comments on both papers, but I prefer to give the
I think.
to people.
Can I just, because I think it's important just for the young people sitting in the room, in the sense that it's true there are disciplines, it's true there's history, it's true there's many others. They all have their own territory and they try to safeguard their territory. Fortunately, I'm not an historian. I can do these things. I don't need to be careful. Probably historians need to be careful with the things that they put out there. I do think that in that context, history needs to be rethought, because scientific knowledge, as we know, and reading Foucault, which is, I think, a very timely reading always, but anyway, I think reading Foucault, we understand that science was also a Western invention to make sure that the hegemony of knowledge production belonged to the West. And in that context, to say that the others, again, don't have that. We are the only ones that can do that. And a very clear example is when we talk about prehistory. Prehistory, as I learned in, I don't know if it changed now, but prehistory, as I learned in university, is the time, how we understand the times before the words, the written word. So how do we think about societies that never had written words? Does it mean that they don't have history because of that? So it's really limited the way in which the methodology is used by history, kind of trying to understand that complex picture that you were kind of suggesting that is brought by the presentation. But in that sense, I think more than going from one discipline to another, I think we have to think collectively. And I think we need to put each other together and understand that not only about data and facts, like global Lisbon, for instance, I don't want to discuss that here, but what we mean about global, right? In the 15th century, for instance, that's problematic to say the least. But nevertheless, what we need to understand is the affects that it also produces on us. Going to an exhibition like that and thinking that, in fact, Lisbon was the center of the world. Which world? Who is saying it? And to whom? And this is something that we need to think. And that goes way beyond history, although historians are subscribing to these narratives, including the museums of discoveries that I was presenting. And if you want to go to the websites, you have the names of the people that are doing this job.
Can I? Não temos tempo, não? No, just, I just have two questions to Patrícia. Okay. In the practices of the Macau Museum, you have said that there is a dissonance between the practices of the post-colonial museums and the practices of the Museum of Macau in this or in a different context, but with a similar history. But one of the images that we have seen that you have shown, it is an exhibition of Cara Walker.
Yes.
Okay, and there is a context of critical post-colonialism in their work. So my question is, how the Macau Museum make the presentation and deals with the presentation of artists and works that are the opposite that you have said, that they are dissonant with strategies and languages of post-colonial artistic practices. The other question that I am curious is, I have understood, I'm not sure that I understood well, that the museum has also an Occidental collection of ancient art okay, and how this collection is presented. Also, in what context this collection is presented inside the museum?
First, I just used the work of Cara as an example that shows that this is not a type of work. It wasn't displayed in Macau Art Museum. There was an image from Tate just to show how and to contrast with the other images that were from museum collections. No. It was just to make a contrast how to the institutions address. Exactly. And the historical paintings of Macau, which is the Western collection that the museum holds, it's a permanent exhibition. And basically, it's a team exhibition. It's divided by places or by teams. Yes, exactly. It's not very. interrogative, or it's not very open to discussion. It was the don't know if you remember. It's the room with it's painted in pink, and it's very contemplative, and it's very.
They assume a design of presentation like a Western museum.
Yes. In that sector, yes. Yeah.
Well, as I imagined, as I supposed, this would be a session because it touches very sensitive and very important matters. Its history, identities, and political. So I want to be provocative, okay? What means, and to take a word that is like a devil word in this history, sorry about my English, it's not so perfect, it's civilization. The narratives of civilization and the European civilization are associated to the discoveries and so on. What means to us to be civilization in now times? In contemporary societies, it means basically to be reflective and plural, committed with a model of citizenship which is critical, it's consciousness, and so, I mean, about the subject of discoveries, is it possible to construct a museum like the Columbia Museum you described? This is a kind of civilized model of museum in contemporary times because it fills the voids of the narratives, because it brings all the voices. The problem with the discoveries is that we have history and narratives on history, and we have some voices speaking in this history. So you have a dominant narrative with voids, the others. And what means to us the word civilization? I'm sociologist, that's why I'm bringing to some concepts. It means that we can open to fill the voids and to cross narratives. It's this. It's the superiority of to be intellectual, you understand? To cross narratives, to represent the voices. It's our commitment, it's our obligation for a global citizenship. So, the question of the discoveries, these kind of proposals, of edutainment proposals are very minor. I mean, concerning to a project of a museum of the discoveries. And it should be done or not, we don't know, but we have here a problem that is the European history and the history also of the world. If you take a kind of cartographical gaze, it's a discovering the world, and some ones are discovering because they are going to the places, and they are discovering, and they are not discovering the others who are in Latin America or Brazil or and so on, in India. The issue is so complex. It's the issue, it's the thematic of remembrance, and how can we have a very emancipated remembrance and to bring all the narratives and to understand that is the writing of history is itself a narrative. Sometimes we cannot change history, but we can rewrite history with all these voices. But it means to me that we might take in this museum all ideological points of view to be a kind of universal museum. Because the Portuguese discoveries, it does not belong only to the Portuguese history. It's a global, universal issue. You understand what I mean? So it's not to take such a position against or for, but to open a space. And I'm really surprised. I belong to a generation that visited the commemoration of the discoveries by the Council of Europe in the 90s, 80s, we have political and state agencies like Instituto Camões, and we have the Orient Foundation. We have a lot of institutions that are devoted to a work which is not only ideological, but it's also scientific in the sense of preservation, an heritage, a Portuguese heritage, which is around the world. But why we have another generation of scholars and historians with other protocols of reading the history and the world. So it's time to assemble all these assets we have about the Portuguese history and to reframe the debates, but not to exclude some points of view. It's not easy. Remembrance, as you know so well, it's an issue in Europe, and it's a very difficult issue. Well, I don't take more time. I don't want to take, but this kind of Macau, for me, is so impressive, what I hear here. Because who are the absent in that narrative? The Portuguese people and the Macau resident people. So it's a more complex model, indeed. To which voice belong this museum? And finally, the Portuguese people were there. And this collection, so it's a kind of palimpsest. And the excluded, the other are the Portuguese, even the other are the Macau people. Some Macau people were not represented in this museum also, not only the Philippines. So it's really a kind of a very strange object, this museum. I'm really impressed with this case study. Thank you. If you have more questions. Precisamos de...
I'm totally in accord with Professor Idalina, and I think what we need is a kind of to make a history of mentalities and ideologies, but also mentalities. There was different mentalities a long time and different narratives that were born in the context of that mentalities. And I just want to the work of Fernand Braudel about the Mediterranean Sea and the story of the Mediterranean. It was the École of the Anal, and he took his whole life to rewrite the history of the Mediterranean, the sea, because there was a narrative that was not include all the voices and all the perspectives. So it's a life work, but I think it's worse. Thank you.
Open the agendas. Yes. Open the agendas of debate.
Just a quick, just a quick comment. If we compare the Portuguese and Spanish colonialism, they are both colonialisms in an economical and political dimension. Just the discourse is slightly different. Because Portugal was, when we say discovery, we are talking about heuristics. It's some kind of, it's a word, it's a concept that pertains to the scientific realm. And we have a research center with the Henry the Navigator, which at the beginning was constructed just to, of course, construct an economy of domination, but at the same time augment the knowledge. So, and if we go to Spain, it's a little different in a discursive way, like Foucault and Tony Bennett could put it. Because Spain was always a continental potencia, power. And they call conquest and not discovery. And this discursive, how do you say in English, turn or difference, it's very symptomatic to me. Because the conquerors, we talk about the Spanish colonialism like the conquistadors that were the agents of that domination. And the Portuguese were much more navigators, trade people that did this kind of colonialism. But in the end, it's the same process. Emanuel Wallerstein, which is a sociologist, an American sociologist, talked about the Portuguese as the power that begins globalization. Colombo reached to discover America in part because he had the knowledge of the maps, because he was married with the daughter of Bartolomeu Prestrelo, which means that she has a knowledge that he appropriate that knowledge and afterwards transform this knowledge in a process of conquest.
Okay.
Maybe that's it.
You want to say something very, very short, very fast?
I managed to say something very fast, but just to say that I totally agree with the differences that you're opposing. I think maybe something that we could discuss further with Pedro. But so just to say, let's not say that Columbus discovered America. Okay, let's say that he just arrived there because there were many people living there when he arrived. And Henrique Dussel, which is a Latin American scholar, he rewrote, more or less as you were saying, in terms of the history of the Mediterranean. He totally rewrote also, and it's something that he's still working on, then to understand the dynamics between Far East Asia and crossing the Pacific towards what we call the Americas nowadays, and the amount of trade and relationships that existed between these two way before the Spaniards and us, so-called, arrived there.
Well, unfortunately, the time, we need to close this session, but it was a pleasure and very, very interesting matters. And I think the value of these encounters is to also, it's a kind of laboratory of ideas to make other conferences, okay? So, for instance, now I hear the word to arrival. From discovering to arriving, this is all a conference about the Portuguese with the concept of diaspora and other diasporas. Maybe it can replace certain vocabulary. And we have here colleagues from Spain and from UK, all old empires. So maybe we will manage another conference about the issue of, and Latin America also, tomorrow, yeah. But, well, it was a pleasure. Many thanks for your attention and foremost for both your presentations. Thank you.
Just to finish the session today, thank you very much to all. Thank you for your wonderful communications and for your wonderful moderation, as usual. I just want to invite you to come again tomorrow. It is also a very interesting and very intense program that beginning with the keynote by at 10 by Peter Nel Vermotel. That was our keynote tomorrow, with the moderations of the panels in the morning by Annika Gunnarsson from the Modern Museet in Stockholm. In the second half of the morning, with the moderation of Joana Cunha Leal, and the sessions of the afternoon with the moderations of Juan Luis Toboso. I remember that the conference finish with the round table at 4:30 p.m. With the theme Disaster Capitalism, Practices and Theories of Resistance and Reinvention, and will be with the presence of the artists Hugo Canoelas and also Maria Trabulo, Paulo Mendes, Axel Stockberger, and I'm sorry, and Stel Neirbat. So that I think that will be a great epilogue for this two-day conference. The program tomorrow, as I said, will be with the participation of many other lectures from Latin America, from points about the educative programs, so will be a very interesting program also. And remind you also that the film program is still screening tomorrow all day, and the exhibition of Canoelas is also, of course, expecting your visit. Thank you. And we hope perhaps tomorrow we have the Prime Minister here. Thank you so much.